for which we have answers. Don't ask questions for which we don't have answers. You know, one of my elders in my family had a word called Adhiga Prasangi. Have you heard this word? Adhiga Prasangi kya kar hai? Adhiga Prasangi means you are asking beyond what you are expected to ask. So even your questions are coded. You can ask question of type A, type B, type C, type D, E, F, G questions. Don't ask. And you become an Adhiga Prasangi. So don't ask those questions. That will rock the boat. Sometimes also be better than others in the family. You have to, he got first rank. If there's a rank above first rank, you should get it. So push like that. And preserve the family name. I've captured about 6. I'm sure there may be many more. But boundaries are set by expectations of others and our own expectations of ourselves. And very often, figuring out what these boundaries are and how do I operate within that is what the good boy diligently does. The ungood boy steps out. He says, all right, why should I abide by these boundaries? Why can't I set my boundaries? Yeah. So if you see a cricketer who is coming in and stepping out of the crease, literally, and smacking the ball for a 4, he's actually challenging certain notions. He's saying, let me play my free stroke. So he's exercising his autonomy. And that is where the question of so how boundaries are held makes a huge difference to whether the person is being a good boy or is being an ungood boy.
Yes, sir.
Which makes me actually, this thing about the autonomy, brings the very critical element of autonomy when you just, I think, ended your conversation with is how do really boundaries set a good boy free to experience his autonomy in any context? Because that's where lies the transformation, right? And I'm sure you have touched upon this in your book many places, how that is the exploration and the the other chapter that you wrote, probably.
The adult development.
Yeah.
I think that's again a very provocative,
enrichment.
Yeah, enrichment.
Yeah. And also his shadow work, that you spoke about, because finally, the shadow part of a good boy remains unexplored for an individual, and he continues to be a good boy, and therefore not really to his fullest, living his life to the full. And that's where comes the biggest challenges, whether it's in a corporate world, a leader who turns out who is not able to exercise his autonomy, leadership, in a relationship, he remains as a compliant person, not really becoming the exploring the possibilities, not risk averse. So I think maybe some behavior which are indicative of a good boy, which can be limiting, could help. And therefore, how could he really explore the autonomy that is his by, breaking out of that shell of a good boy?
So, it's very important to note that the good boy also has a certain modicum of autonomy. Now, he has what I would call as conditional autonomy. Sounds like an oxymoron, right? Conditional and autonomy are kind of opposing words. But the good boy has a certain conditioned or conditional autonomy. He has autonomy to operate within a certain radius. Now, the radius may be a very short, constrictive, restrictive radius, or it can be a wider one. That depends on the context of the family that he is part of or the organization that he is part of. It does not matter. So there are different diameters and radii of boundaries that are available within which the good boy can exercise his autonomy. So what you can... Now, one of the things, for example, and I've written about this, in today's times, if you look at the generation, the young people today, societal norms have and are indeed changing quite a bit. So, for example, what was not common 30 years ago, like dating, right, or live-in relationships, premarital sex. So, if I just take these 3 as an example, they were not common in say 30, 40 years ago. Yet they are increasingly becoming part of the social fabric today. Now, a person who operates saying, I can practice any of these, is still being a good boy because he is operating according to the autonomy that his context is giving him today. Right? So so good boy is not a moral thing. You should not do that. It's sin. So we're not talking about that kind of goodness. We are talking about goodness as defined by the expectations of the context in which the person is living. So the good boy has a certain amount of autonomy which is conditioned and narrated to him. He's socialized into the context that he lives in. The ungood boy, on the other hand, and there's a very interesting chapter 6 which talks about adult development and the good boy syndrome. It says there are different levels of development of the mind that are possible as we live our lives. The ungood boy operates with a different type of autonomy. His autonomy is not conditioned or conditional autonomy. It is his own self-authored autonomy. He says, I want to do this. And I want to step out of the boundaries and I will do certain things that others have not. It may not be expected of me, but I will still do it. And may not also do. Exactly. That's right. That's true. So it does not mean that he has to necessarily do something. He may say, I will not participate in this act. And that is I will exercise my autonomy to not do that. Absolutely. That's very much a part of.
So, one of the questions I want to ask is, organizations continue to struggle with women's participation in the workforce, right? We find that beyond a certain level, the number of women who grow up to middle management or senior management positions is limited. While a lot of factors are around what women want to do, how much of it is contributed by the good boy syndrome?
That's something that I haven't thought about. It's a very interesting question. I'm going to go out on a limb and take a wager on this.
Yeah.
And I think it's a fairly significant contributor to that phenomenon could come from the good boy syndrome. And I'll tell you my reasoning for that is that for organizations and for people in traditionally organization given power. So if I'm, let's say, the head of the organization or the executive head, for me, it's easier to have my writ continue to run if I'm bringing in the good boy and I'm promoting the good boy into higher and senior roles and locating that person, even though the person may not be entirely competent to do, so that role which the person is playing may not flourish by his good boyness, but he still gets promoted into those roles simply because from a leadership perspective, it serves the needs of the leader to do this. Now, this may be a bit of a cynical view, so I'm happy to be proven wrong. It's possible that this is not really practiced. But having said that, if I think through it, it's possible. I think that the good boy continues to enjoy the Chhatra Chaya, the patronage of the seniors, because that allows them to continue their agenda. Now, if I'm looking at women participation in the workforce, I think it raises a lot of inconveniences for traditional male leaders. Right? And many of the male leaders may themselves be good boys, or they may be self-centric boys. Let's also remember that India is continuing to be a patriarchal society. Now, this goes back to the patriarchy thing that we talked about. Patriarchy is very much prevalent in organizational spaces as well. So it's not that patriarchy is I see it in villages, I see it there in some distant place, but sorry, in organizations are as much patriarchal. So, in a patriarchal setup, it is more likely that you will have either the good boy or the self-centric boy rise to the top, ungood boy also increasingly. But women coming in, ungood boys will happen in the future, but I think there is both ungood boy and increasing women participation raises certain inconveniences for traditional male bastions of power. That's my thought around.
Also, I'm wondering, the paradigm of the good boy could be that men should be the providers and women should be the caregivers. Is part of the good boy paradigm, and women coming into the workforce upsets that order.
Yes.
Correct? That's also another possibility. And therefore, will the good boy re-examine their structure and boundaries be necessary for greater women participation? Sharada, what do you think?
I definitely feel the idea is time has come that good boy syndrome it needs to be self-explored by people in any relationship, in any context, whether even as a team player. What is it that I'm losing out by being a good boy? Okay, therefore, what more can I be by being, coming out of that good boy, trap? I would put it that way. And therefore, my next question was, if I have to give this book, because I come across many men in my coaching, spouses of my women coaches who have this dimension of good boy, and the women not knowing how to challenge that because expectations of a woman, as Ganesh said, that they're really transforming very fast, too fast probably, than the male partner. Okay, and the male partner in his traditional role is much slower. And my compassion goes for them that they also need a lot of programs and workshops, which I've been always telling that need to be supported. Just like women have a lot of support in the social structure to come out, break out of their traditional roles and, discover who they are. So in that context, if I have to give this book, Karthikeyan, to somebody, as an opportunity to explore oneself, which chapter, because not everybody is a reader now, so which chapter can I suggest? They can connect emotionally and therefore their curiosity gets, lifted to read the full book.
All right. So just before responding to that question, I will just add one bit which I want to say is that the good boy is not a trap, Sharada. Since you use the word, the good boy phenomenon or syndrome is not necessarily a trap. It can be trapping. And indeed, I think a whole lot of men, and not just men, but women also who subscribe to that syndrome and observe it, or families and organizations, are quite deeply trapped by it. But intrinsically it is not, because if we say it is a trap, then there is no hope for the good boy. And therefore, I just want to hasten to add, because I think where I've ended the book is that we need to look at hope for the good boy. We cannot, say that he's a vestigial or redundant and irrelevant kind of thing, because there are so many good boys. And so I just wanted to say that it can be a trap, but I think it's up to us. It's up to people like you who are all here to question this and then say, okay, can I unleash the positives of the good boy, which are immense and which can be refashioned for the times to come. Now, having said that, to go back to your question, I wish it was an easy one to say, just pick up, chapter 3 and read it and you will, I really think it really goes back to how you understand that person. So, for example, many of the chapters I feel they appeal to different types of people. For example, somebody may really want to know their shadow side, for whom they're, especially if you see that the person is struggling with expression of aggression, expression of their sexuality, expression of anger. So they become passive aggressive, etc. Or their curiosity has become dulled over repeated admonition, etc. They may find some release by reading the chapter on the shadow. Maybe they can get started there. They could equally read the one which is on the angst and sorrow of the good boy. A good boy has a sorrow. He carries a sorrow with him. What is that? Absolutely. In fact, one of the quotes I've talked about in the book is that for the good boy, his belonging is taken care of. Please pay attention to this. His belonging is taken care of, but his longing is not. He's actually, his family will take care of his belonging. Yeah, you come, you have a place here with us, etc., etc. But his desire, his need, his wishes, not all of them. So very often the context doesn't pay attention to it. So belonging traded off for longing. So I can let my longing go as long as I'm getting the patronage of the family. So a lot of good boys are like that. So what's that? Madi with Madhu, yes. Thank you. Yes, very, very powerful one. Very, yeah, very interesting one. Having also said that, I think there are some people for who may be a little more cognitively interested in saying, okay, I understand. We have this question, right? Very often in leadership circles, we ask these questions: what, so what, and now what, right? So for people who are on the cognitive and conceptual frame, it will be very helpful for them to perhaps read about chapter 6, which talks about the adult development model, and then see where they can go with it. For people who are more sociologically, who say, I'm writing about all this good boy, but how does it fit in the society? They may like to talk about the patriarchy part. So there are different entry points for the book, but I won't say that there is one which will appeal to everybody. So then it goes back to you as the one who's kind of offering that they read something to say, hey, I know you, I see you struggling with this, please start with this chapter, or maybe at least read this one chapter.
Lax, I have a question for you. In many organizations, the early days, we asked for a lot of compliance and conformance to processes because that contributes to scale, excellence, discipline, things working very smoothly. Would you agree with that? Yeah. And then we suddenly want them to be innovative, break the mold, think out of the box, deal with disruption. Do you see any connection between this and the football?
Yeah, in fact, that is something that I was thinking as you were speaking. When we are typecasting a good boy as someone who conforms to the processes, who conforms to the rules, the leaders like him because he obeys orders, everything else. In organizations today, you have a fair majority of a bunch of guys who don't follow these processes. There's a vast set of guys who don't follow processes, who do things as they do, and they perform. So the question is, you are used to, as Ganesh said, you come from organizations which follow processes, Six Sigma, all of those things, and then you are thrown to a bunch of cowboys who produce results, but look, they do things their own way. So now, from a leadership perspective, you are left with a bunch of good boys that you need to manage, but you are also left with a bunch of boys who don't conform to any of these things, but they produce results. I mean, take an organization where there is a large majority of a sales team. I mean, you definitely don't associate processes, compliance, all of those things with those team members, with no disrespect meant to them. But you need all of them to coexist. You can't say, I need an organization of conformists and good boys, but I'm also going to be given a bunch of other guys that I need to manage. So there is a paradox there that we need to see in a family surroundings. It's not as stark because the numbers are not large, and you are not driven for results. When someone doesn't conform to the family values, he is an outcast. So you don't expect him to perform or do anything for the family. But whereas in an organization, you need to carry everybody along and deliver. So there is a bit of paradox there, and that comes from what you started. So that's, and to me, this existed even before we knew what a good boy was. So it is not a good boy, fallout of what you've defined as a good boy. This existed in organizations where we had a set of routine ops team members, compliance, finance, processes, everything, and then there is a bunch of others that we needed to manage. So this is not a new problem, but the numbers are increasing on the other side. The number of conformists are actually slowly shifting away as we get into this new economy and startups, etc. The number of guys on the other side are actually increasing, leading to an imbalance of, how do you deal with this?
Actually, coincidentally, this afternoon I was thinking of pretty much on the similar lines. Is this audible? Is this there? So, to me, I think the shift is definitely there. The organizations are demanding more of ungoodness. So, And they also sometimes have self-centric boys. Give him whatever he wants, he will hit the ball out of the park, he will do. He may be a jerk, he may be an irritating specimen, but he's getting something done. So let us suffer him. So people, and the good boys come and say, now what happened? I mean, why am I not getting the attention that somebody else is getting? So this is a very interesting thing that is existing today. My research suggests that there is a difference between organizational demands and expectations and the inner psychic reality of the person. So, for example, if I quoted all of this in the book, 80% of the Indian males, as per the database that I have with me of the transformative alignment map, 80% of the people reported being good boys of the Indian population, self-reported, 80%. I've used identities like custodian, provider of resources, guide, mentor. So if I look at it, it's 80%. Either as my primary pool or my secondary pool, we are good boys. If I cut the data to say, let me pick up only Indian males who are less than 10 years of experience, which means bringing it into today's generation in some sense, the number hasn't fallen drastically. Maybe it has come from 80% between the two to about 70%. Yes, there's a shift, but it's not a dramatic one, like it's not 30%. So the gap is that internally the psychic landscape of the person is still coded with goodness, but he is coming to an organization role where he is expected to be ungood or self-centric, and it's creating a certain dissonance, which Ravi Kairan, one of the persons, he's a CHR of Bajaj Auto, he captures it beautifully. He says that 30 years ago, the biggest difficulty for corporate leaders was guilt. Have I done this? Have I gone over budget? Have I done something? You have heard this term, I'm sure. Asking forgiveness is better than asking for permission. So something like I do something, but I have to go and ask for forgiveness. Today, if you look at the greatest mental syndrome that bothers people is not guilt. It's moved to anxiety. It's a it's almost like a pandemic there, right? So anxiety is one of the biggest things. So people are living with this double bind. I mean, I'm expected to be, I have my coding of being a good boy. My role is expecting me to be something else. And how do I manage this? But I wanted to say one, and I think we'll go into probably questions, right? So real quick one, I want to say that we have to repurpose the good boy, and it's important for people like people who are all leaders, managers, captains of industry who now are future. Goodness is not something that is, good boy is not a life sentence, he's got is in jail forever kind of thing. We have to be able to understand. So the way of treating this, can we help the good boy from being people pleasing to be more purpose driven? Purpose driven is also good boy. So he has to see that his need to commit can move from societal norms to more of intentional values, purpose-driven values. He can be guided to go there. Can you as leaders help the good boy to avoid the martyr trap? No, I become the martyr, I sacrifice myself for, can we have conversations with him that help him to see himself as a valued contributor, not a martyr whose manam, honor is at stake. You have these ungood boys and self-centric boys being dominant guys, right? Like Elon Musk, very in your face, charismatic dominance. In place of that, can the good boy become the subtle influencer, which he can. He can really influence him very well. Right? You have, for every Elon Musk, you have a Satya Nadella, who's been an archetypal good boy in many ways. And he's equally successful. And also, can the good boy practice a form of rebellion which is not often talked about? He can practice self-sustaining rebellion for the system. For example, the good boy can be the one who will ask managers and leaders saying, at what cost are you doing this? The cost question is often not asked. I'm not talking about financial cost, I'm talking about a psychological cost. So, I think there's a case for more Patagonias to come into the world. There's a possibility of more of those happening. But I think for that we have to understand the good boy not as a trap, but as having the seeds of something immensely powerful. That if only we are able to understand that, have empathy for that, and unleash it's leashed today. It's fettered today. It's caught in a conceptual mind. We treat it like the appendix. The appendix is a vestigial organ. Even in the book, you have something called appendix, which is there right in the book. If you want to read it, you read the appendix or not. Bring the good boy to the center stage, reposition him. You'll find that he's probably able to run head to head with the ungood fellow.
Raise a question.
All right, so going back to the discussion on the relevance of peculiar, I pondered the question, how much does the peculiarity arise due to the Indian context? Would the global characteristics of peculiar be different? That's a very interesting question. Do you want to take a thought of that? I'm thinking that, let's go ahead, but my quick response to that is, I think the characteristics of peculiar may differ from context to context. But peculiar is peculiar. I mean, like, what may be peculiar in the Indian context, for the same, by the same token, you have perhaps a very peculiar thing in a global north context.
So, are there cultural influences that would determine the difference? The culture that is prevalent, in which the environment in which the person is exposed to, is what would constitute the difference. And therefore, culturally, I think there are a lot of similarities where a person is exposed to societal and family context, and say, because sometimes the society is very different what a person is exposed to, especially the younger generation. So I think to that extent, they would not be very different, but probably the prevalence of it would be different, is what I perceive.
That makes sense. I also want to quickly say that in India, perhaps the peculiar comes from the good boy syndrome. If I were to think of the United States or some developed global north nation, the peculiarity there may be the dominant male.
Sure.
So there's still a peculiarity there, but it is peculiar to their context, which is different than ours. Looking at another question here, which is, what was the personal,
Point.
the
That
turning?
tried to write the book. Was there a moment when you recognized the good boy syndrome in yourself? And others?
Yeah. Painfully, I think. I mean, it was not one morning I woke up and I discovered that, life has been that of the good boy. I think it's been an ongoing set of inquiries. I think I must say that, look, ever since the 90s, I've had I've been associated with, and to continue now, I've been associated with two very critical institutions. One is called Sumedas, the other is called the Group Relations India. So these are the institutions which are essentially behavioral sciences anchored, which offer spaces to question oneself. So it was through processes like this that, the question of what are you doing with yourself, who are you, and what are you up to, are questions that have constantly, the word is not besieged, but they have constantly come at me. And then I've had a part of the turning point. So it was not a dramatic turning point. It was a turning arc, or something that happened over time.
So I want to ask a question,
Sure.
difficult question. When you associate a voice with the good boy, is it the voice of a mother or a voice of a spouse?
You take the truth of this question. It's a tricky question.
It's a good one.
It's the voice of the mother, of the spouse, at which point of life?
Yeah. No, I think if I speak from personal experience, it's really been the mother. The early stages of formation have been very much the mother.
Mother, to say good boy.
To say good boy. Or if you did something, you went out of line, you would not be called a bad boy, but like I've talked about in the book, affirmation comes for the good boy. It does not mean the not good boy is punished necessarily, but affirmation comes for the good boy.
How do you recommend parents and educators begin shifting the early narrative that contributes to the syndrome of young boy? Last question.
It's a good one, Ramesh from Tinagar. Great question. I think I'd like to say the question that everybody says it today. They say that, look, it has to begin in school, it has to begin at home, curriculum has to change, families need to. So sometimes I find myself getting a little cynical when I answer this way. Because I say, okay, this has been, it's common sense, right? What do we not know about this? However, I think that thing of saying curriculum has to change, parents have to change, is all we can shout from the rooftops, but nothing really changes because that's kind of like something hard coded there. It has to go somewhere more than that. I don't know if any of you have watched this new series that's all the rage called Adolescence on Netflix. It's a very interesting one. I would recommend that you watch it because it talks about the relationship between a boy and his father and mother and poses some very tough questions for you. It cannot be solved by curriculum change necessarily. It cannot be solved by just having, let's sit as a family and talk. Yeah, they may help, but they are necessary but not sufficient conditions. And I think, if I ask me, I don't have a ready answer, but I think it's an important one, educators and parents to sit and to really, really engage and ask their questions, to ask themselves this question. What will do this? And hope somebody takes this research up and does. It's a very important one for the nation.
Vinay, yeah.
MBA itself has a bad boy context, married but available. In the same vein, Karthik and I were in school and college. Yeah. He says that I was a bad boy in college, and which, if I was sitting there, I would perhaps say the same thing about Vinay. In fact, all of you will know, you must know one thing so that I can put this specious argument to rest. I made a wager with him. Vinay, will you please stand up there or just put your hand up? So I told him that, look, if I have a son, I will name him after you. I did. My second child, boy, his name was Vinay, and then I wrote to him saying that, look, I've kept my side of so it was a one-sided bargain. He never offered me anything. So who was the bad boy and who was the good boy? I'll leave it to this august audience to decide. But isn't being a good boy is situational? That's question is, isn't the good boy situational? Yes, contextual. Yes and no, Vinay. I think, yes, there are some parts of the good boy which are entirely contextual. In a particular context, I might just adapt. However, if I am making conscious decisions to be good in this context, I may actually be the ungood boy. I may say, here, let me wear the mask of the good boy so that I can do certain things in this context. Yeah. So contextual good boy is very likely to be the ungood boy, but the good boy is otherwise a very prevalent, long-lasting syndrome.
Thank you. I have to be the good boy and conclude the discussion.